Everyone who watched The Office remembers Jim Halpert the same way. The good one. The normal one. The guy you rooted for from season 1 to the finale. The guy who looked at the camera like you were in on the joke together. The guy who was too smart for Dunder Mifflin, too decent for the drama, too in love with Pam to be anything other than the romantic hero of the whole story. And here's the thing. That's exactly what the show wanted you to think. That's the whole con. Because when you actually go back and watch Jim Halpert without the halo the show gives him, without the soft indie music and the warm camera and the lovable smirk pulling you to his side, what you find is a guy who is so much more complicated and so much more uncomfortable than any of us were willing to admit while we were watching. I'm not talking about him being a bad person. I'm not here to cancel Jim Halpert. I'm talking about something quieter and honestly a lot more disturbing than that. I'm talking about a guy who built his entire identity around being better than the people around him, who used that identity to avoid ever actually looking at himself, and who got away with it for 9 seasons because he was charming enough and the camera loved him enough that nobody ever really pushed back, and once you see it, you can't stop seeing it. Let's start with the thing that everyone kind of noticed but nobody wanted to say out loud. Jim Halpert was cruel to Dwight Schrute for years, and the show framed it as comedy. Okay, fine. Dwight is ridiculous. Dwight believes in beet farming and bears and Battlestar Galactica and has a messiah complex the size of a barn. He makes it easy. But here's what you have to actually sit with. Jim didn't just prank Dwight when Dwight was being insufferable. He pranked him constantly, systematically, with planning and forethought and genuine creative investment. He put Dwight's stapler in Jell-O. He convinced Dwight his desk had been moved to the bathroom. He dressed as Dwight and did a full impression of him to his face. He sent him faxes from future Dwight. He trained him to expect candy every time a computer made a sound, like a psychological experiment on a human being who sat 3 feet away from him every single day. And in the real world, not the sitcom world, if you did that to a coworker, if you spent years systematically messing with someone's head for fun, that's not quirky. That's workplace harassment. That's targeted humiliation dressed up in a smirk and a camera glance. But Jim never had to reckon with that because the show never made him. Dwight was always the butt of the joke. Jim was always the architect of the joke, and the audience laughed. So it was fine. It was always fine. Except it wasn't. And here's the thing that really got under my skin when I started paying attention. Jim didn't just prank Dwight. He looked down on basically everyone. Michael Scott was an idiot to him. Andy was a clown to him. Kevin was basically a walking punchline to him. Ryan was a pretentious fraud, which, fair, but also Jim barely hid his contempt. Even his friendships, even with Pam, even with the people he actually liked, there was always this thin layer of superiority sitting underneath everything. This sense of, I see you more clearly than you see yourself. I am the only genuinely self-aware person in this building. And the most important part, the part that took me the longest to clock, that's not a personality trait. That's a defense mechanism. Jim Halpert spent 9 years at a paper company he never intended to stay at. He had no plan, no ambition he was willing to act on, no dream he was willing to chase. He was coasting, actively, consciously coasting. And the only way to make that feel okay was to be smarter than the place he was stuck in. If Dunder Mifflin is a joke, then Jim isn't failing to leave. Jim is just too good to care. If Michael is ridiculous and Dwight is insane and the whole office is a circus, then Jim isn't wasting his life. He's just a normal, reasonable guy surrounded by absurdity. The smirk at the camera wasn't just charm. It was Jim protecting himself. Every single look was him saying, you see this, right? You see how crazy this is? You see how I don't belong here? Because as long as you were nodding along, he didn't have to admit the truth, which is that he absolutely belonged there because he never left. And then Pam. Oh, Pam. This is where it gets really complicated. Jim loved Pam. I'm not arguing that. The love was real. The confession in the parking lot, the casino night kiss, the proposal at the gas station in the rain, those moments were real and they were earned and they hit the way they were supposed to hit. But let's talk about who Pam was before Jim and who she became after, because I think we glossed over something important. When the show starts, Pam Beasley is engaged to Roy. Roy is not a great guy. He's dismissive, he's checked out, he takes her for granted in ways that are painful to watch, and Jim is right there being everything Roy isn't, paying attention to her, making her laugh, seeing her, and we root for Jim to get the girl. Of course we do. That's the setup, but here's the thing nobody really interrogated. Jim spent 3 years being Pam's emotional support while she was engaged to someone else. He built an entire intimacy with her, an entire private world of jokes and glances and little moments that belonged to just the two of them, while she was with Roy, and then he was confused and hurt when she didn't just immediately leave Roy and be with him. He told her he loved her and she didn't reciprocate the way he wanted, and he punished her for it. He transferred to Stamford. He started dating Karen. He came back with Karen and made sure Pam saw it. Now look, I understand that. He was protecting himself. He was hurt. He's a human being. But we never called it what it actually was. A man who spent years emotionally investing in a woman who wasn't available to him, told her how he felt without really giving her space to process it, and then used another relationship to make her jealous when she didn't respond on his timeline. And the show treated this as romantic tension, which it is, but only if you're in Jim's corner. If you're standing outside of it, it looks a lot more like someone who developed an obsession with a woman he couldn't have and made the entire office his personal backdrop for a love story he was writing, without anyone else's full consent. Karin Filippelli probably deserved better, by the way. I want to say that clearly. Karen was a real person with real feelings who moved her life to a different city partly for Jim, and Jim ended things in the most brutal way possible at the most brutal time possible, which was the moment he got what he actually wanted. He drove to the beach with her, went to talk to Pam, and that was it. Karen was done.
And the show barely gave her a scene to process that. She just became a footnote in the Jim and Pam story because that's how the show handled anyone who got in the way of Jim and Pam. They became obstacles, not people, obstacles.
And here's where we have to talk about season 8 and 9 because this is where Jim's whole constructed identity finally starts cracking, and what comes out of those cracks is genuinely ugly. Later called Athlete, Jim's sports marketing startup. On paper, it's his dream, the thing he was always supposed to be doing instead of selling paper, and he goes for it. Good for him. Except he doesn't tell Pam about it. Not really. He gets involved in something that is going to consume his time and money and relocate him to Philadelphia for weeks at a time, and he just kind of slides into it before she fully understands what she's agreeing to. And when Pam struggles with it, when she pushes back, when she says this is too much and I feel alone and you're not here, Jim does something that I think is the most revealing thing he does in the entire series. He makes her feel like she's being small, like she's holding him back, like she doesn't believe in him. He talks about this opportunity in a way that frames her concern as a failure of support, when what she's actually saying is, you made a major life decision without me, and now I'm managing 2 kids and an entire house alone, and I feel like your teammate became your roommate. And Jim can't hear it. He can't sit in the discomfort of being the guy who got it wrong, because Jim Halpert's whole identity is that he's the good guy. He's the self-aware one. He's the one who sees clearly. And the moment Pam holds up a mirror and shows him something he doesn't want to see, he can't do it. He deflects. He frames it as her issue. He gives her the look, the same look he gives the camera. Like, can you believe this? Except now it's turned on the person he's supposed to be closest to in the world. There's a specific scene in season 9 that just destroys me when I watch it knowing all of this. Pam does the documentary panel. She's at this table talking to people, and she says something like, I spent so long just being Jim's partner. Pam from reception. And she never thought about what she wanted, about what her dream was. And you can hear in her voice that Jim being great at his dream came at a cost she never agreed to pay. And the thing is, Jim never really clocked that. Not fully. Not in the way it deserved to be reckoned with. The show resolves it. He sells his shares, he comes back, they go to couples counseling, they make it through. And it's framed as growth. It's framed as them saving the relationship and that being enough. But I kept thinking about what Pam had to compress to get there. She had wanted to be an artist. We knew that from season 1. She had her drawings up. She had the watercolor she made of the office building that Michael bought, and it made her cry. She went to art school in New York, failed out of one class, and came back because Jim was in Scranton, and her life was in Scranton, and that was the shape of things. And the show played that as her choosing love over ambition, which is a choice, a real choice some people make, but it was also a woman shrinking herself to fit into a life that had already been shaped around someone else's comfort. Pam Beasley married her best friend, and found out that the man who saw her better than anyone else could not actually see what it cost her to be with him. And Jim never had to fully answer for that, because the show wasn't really built to make him answer for it. The camera was always on his side, and this is the thing that took me longest to get to. The camera the entire show is a documentary. In universe, there are camera crews following these people for years, and the way the footage gets used, the way the story gets told, it centers Jim, it flatters Jim, it gives his pranks a comedic frame that absolves them, it gives his story a score, it gives his smirks context, it makes us complicit. Every time Jim looks at the camera, he's recruiting you. He's saying, you get it, right? You're with me. And we said yes, every single time. We were with him, but what would this show look like if the camera was equally invested in Dwight? What if we got the scene where Dwight goes home after the stapler prank and just feels humiliated and doesn't understand why someone who sits next to him every day invests that much energy into making him look stupid? What would it look like if we got Karen's version of those last few weeks? Or Roy's? Because Roy by the end of the show had actually done the work. He went to therapy, he figured out what he'd done wrong with Pam, he moved on and found someone and treated her well. But we didn't get that story in real time. We got it as a footnote because Roy was Jim's obstacle, and once Jim won, Roy's growth became trivia. The Office is a great show. I'm not arguing that. 9 seasons, brilliant comedy, genuine heart, characters you remember forever. Michael Scott is one of the greatest TV characters ever written, full stop. But the show made a choice, a deliberate structural choice, to put the camera in Jim's pocket. And once you notice that, once you realize that Jim Halpert's entire goodness was partly constructed by the angle the story was shot from, everything looks a little different. Because here's what Jim actually was. When you strip away the soft lighting and the Sufjan Stevens needle drops and the camera glances, he was a funny, charming, deeply avoidant guy who used irony as armor and superiority as a substitute for self-examination. He was someone who could see everyone else's flaws with perfect clarity and had almost no ability to sit with his own. He was a man who loved Pam genuinely and still managed to make their marriage about his growth, his dreams, his reckoning, while she was just supposed to hold it together in the background and be grateful when he came back. And here's the thing that makes all of this genuinely complicated instead of just a takedown. Jim Halpert is not a villain. He's not a bad husband. husband, and he's not a terrible person. He's something way more uncomfortable than that. He's recognizable. He's the guy who's a little too comfortable in his own perspective, who mistakes self-awareness for actually doing the work, who is good at noticing things and bad at changing them, who cares deeply and still centers himself in the moments when someone else needed to be centered, who never had to really reckon with the damage his charm was doing because everyone around him either loved him too much to say it or the system, in this case literally a documentary film crew, was built to protect his image. That is not a cartoon villain. That is a person a lot of us know. That is a person some of us have been. And Pam knew. On some level, Pam always knew. She saw him clearly enough to stay. She loved him clearly enough to fight. And she was smart enough to know that the guy who understood her better than anyone else was also the guy who, when it came down to it, needed her to be small enough to fit beside his life instead of building one beside hers. The documentary ends. The show ends. Jim and Pam are fine. They're going to Austin. They're good. And everyone watching felt the warmth of that and exhaled. But somewhere in that final season, Pam said something that I think is the realest line in 9 years of television. She said she'd been waiting for something for a long time and she hadn't been saying it out loud. And she was talking about Jim, about wanting him to actually see her, not the version of her that fit his story. Her and the camera, faithful to the end, zoomed in on Jim's face right after, warm and handsome and a little misty-eyed. And you felt good about it. You were supposed to feel good about it. That's the whole trick. That's been the whole trick the entire time. Do you think Jim Halpert is still the good guy of The Office? Or have we all been looking at him through the show's lens for too long? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, hit like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.